I've been asked many times how a scientist like myself can also be a Christian at the same time. And in fact, when I first began to follow Christ, I had the same question because I didn't know any other scientists who were Christians. It turns out that, in fact, the two are closely tied with each other. Experimental science in Europe began among Christians, and for most of history since then, most scientists were Christians, many of them very devout. Quite a few very prominent scientists, both in the past and in modern days, have been Christians. This picture shows Charles Towns, Galileo, Copernicus, Maxwell, Alexander Fleming, and Ampere, all of whom are famous scientists who were Christians. And it's also a fact that there are a number of organizations composed of and devoted to the interaction between science and Christian faith. That includes the American Scientific Affiliation, which has over 3,000 members, all scientists, all Christians, the BioLogos Foundation, the British group Christians in Science, and Reasons to Believe. We often hear about studies that purport to show that scientists, or perhaps the so called top scientists, are mostly atheists. Often the statistics are misquoted. Elaine Eklund is a sociologist who studies the attitudes of scientists. Here's some data from one of her papers. What she found is that scientists do not differ substantially from the general public when it comes to some measures of religiosity. The idea that there are basic truths in many religions is shared by the majority of scientists almost as much as in the general public. Furthermore, there are almost as many scientists who consider themselves to be very religious as do non-scientists. And finally, while about half of the general public are sure that God exists, the same idea is present in about a third of scientists, meaning that a much larger fraction of working scientists are convinced of the truth of theism than is generally recognized. We have seen many examples of scientists who are devout Christians, and have seen examples of both famous scientists from the past as well as contemporary scientists, including Nobel Prize winners, who are Christians. I have been blessed and thrilled to have met and spent some time with 3 of the top American scientists who profess a deep Christian faith. They are Francis Collins, geneticist and director of the NIH, Jennifer Wiseman, astronomer and discoverer of the Wiseman-Skiff comet, and Bill Phillips, Nobel laureate in physics. All 3 happen to live and work in the Washington, D.C. area, where I also live. Let's hear what 2 of them, Drs. Wiseman and Collins, have to say. A link to a similar video from Dr. Phillips is in the description.
John Polkinghorne, a physicist who became an Anglican priest later in life, said that science and theology are both concerned with the search for truth. In consequence, they complement each other rather than contrast one another. Of course, the 2 disciplines focus on different dimensions of truth, but they share a common conviction that there is truth to be sought. And that's key here, because science is driven by this passion that there is truth that can be discerned through investigation. And the same is true of religion, and in that there is a common goal. I would caution you to beware of nothing buttery. Have you ever heard the phrase nothing buttery? Nothing buttery, and there's not agreement on who coined this phrase. But it says beware when you hear something that sounds like we are nothing but this or nothing but that, okay? We are nothing but our genes. We are nothing but our brain chemistry. We are nothing but atoms and molecules. That's what's called nothing buttery. And it turns out that nothing buttery is usually false. We are more than these components that science can study. Yes, we have a genetic code that has a very interesting relationship to the kinds of people we turn out to be. Yes, our neuroscience dictates a lot, but does that mean it negates our entire sense of free will? That's something that most neuroscientists would say absolutely not. Are we only our chemistry? No. We are more than that. So beware when you read a science article that you don't fall into the trap of believing that we are nothing but what science tells us about different components of our being. With King David, who wrote in his psalm, O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you've established, what are human beings that you're mindful of them, and mortals that you care for them? And yet, even with that sense of insignificance, you've made us a little lower than God and crowned us with glory and honor, given them dominion over the works of your hands, put all things under their feet.
I am at the point now of saying, I believe. And I want Jesus to be my leader. I want to be in that particular group of followers, and that will be the rock I want to stand on. And that was 41 years ago. And people who I immediately told about that thought it was amusing, and also suggested that I was on a path towards a brain explosion, because how could you possibly, as somebody who wants to study of all things genetics, which is going to lead you to information about origins, also be somebody who wants to study the Bible and be a believer. I got to tell you, 41 years later, I have not encountered an obstacle of any sort to putting those ways of knowing together. They are two ways of knowing. Yeah, I know it's a bit of a trite cliche, but it's kind of true. Science answering how, faith answering why. And we are given the privilege as scientists who are Christians to read both of those books. This is Bacon's wonderful analogy that I love to use, the book of God's words and the book of God's works. And if we do believe that God is the author of both of those, then how could they be in conflict? If we see a conflict, then surely we are the ones who have misunderstood the science or the biblical interpretation, or oftentimes both. But somehow we should not feel that as Christians we have to defend God against science. Isn't God the author of all that? And that has been for me a truly satisfying experience. I think I'm blessed that I didn't grow up in a perspective where the church was saying you have to believe a certain perspective about origins or your faith is at risk. And so many Christians in the past and in the present have been caught up in that. And I didn't have that burden to carry. So I could put together what I read in Genesis 1 and 2 and what I know from studying the genome in a fashion that illuminates and enlightens.
I hope this video has been enlightening as to the question of whether a scientist can be a Christian. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, make any comments you want, and God bless you all.